Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for the first time here on the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, we'll be talking about a new sport, college basketball. The season is heating up. We're getting ever closer to March Madness, the excitement that brings. And I just wanted to talk about a couple top contenders and where they kind of fit in the whole scheme of March Madness in terms of whether or not I believe they're true championship Final Four contenders or are on the precipice of potentially breaking through or could be on the outside looking in but still can make some deep tournament runs. Now, this college basketball season has been one that I've been paying a little bit more attention to, but I'm not necessarily certain that I'll be able to give you that much intel on all these teams. I have seen a couple of these teams play, and I do feel like I kind of can gauge where they could be come March Madness. But this is all just hypotheticals. Remember, this March Madness tournament is a crapshoot, and we never know what's going to happen. So any one of these teams could win, or someone entirely different could. But seeing as to how, for the first month of the season, we're finally starting to gain a better sense of all these teams, I thought this was appropriate to kind of rank them in terms of tiers to see how they pan out come March Madness. So without further ado, let's jump right into them, starting off with Tier 1. These are the teams that I believe are highly capable of not just making it to the Final Four, but also being able to win the national championship. Now, all of these teams kind of have one specific trait that I feel they're going to be able to lean on come March that I truly believe separates them from the rest of the pack. And it's a group of 5 teams that I've seen kind of in equal amounts, and I feel like I know that they can do it. It's just a question of how they do it. But ultimately, these Tier 1 teams I truly believe in, and it starts with Houston, a team that clearly has proven over the past 5 years they are true championship March Madness contenders through their physical brand of defense. Kelvin Sampson really loves preaching winning through defense, and he finally has a well-built team with 2 guys in the front court in Javier Francis, J.Juan Roberts, who truly buy into that sentiment. They're fantastic two-way players as well. They have a lot of balance, this team as well. LJ Cryer, an experienced point guard, leading them in terms of his production on the offensive end, and ultimately being a team that I feel has a chip on its shoulder. Because over the past couple of years, you felt that they finally got everything right. They had a point guard in Jamal Shead, who was really one of the best point guards in college basketball throughout most of his career. They ultimately came up short last year in that legendary game that went to overtime. I believe it was against Texas A&M. And ultimately just had a couple of frustrating years. But this could potentially be the year. And other teams that could follow suit in this group, Iowa State. For the first time, I saw them Saturday on the road in a tough environment against Texas Tech in a Big 12 game. You know how high stakes those can be. And they really impressed me in being able to come back in those couple final moments and take it in overtime and ultimately win that game in overtime. They're not just as like Houston, an aggressive defensive team. They have offensive pieces. I love Joshua Jefferson in the front court, Curtis Jones in the backcourt, leading this team on the inside and outside. They're very, very versatile. They're very, very fast. They can beat you in transition and on the fast break. And then in terms of Kentucky, if you want a team with a more layered attack, this team is for you. I like every single one of these players. Andrew Carr, I loved him. I watched him against Duke, one of the most underrated players in the country. With the balance they have in both the backcourt with Jackson Robinson, a very experienced player in Big 12 environments, now in the SEC. Was the Big 12 Sixth Man of the Year last year for BYU. Really impressive young man. And also just the fact that they're really buying in to Mark Pope's culture as well, as he is the new head coach there in Kentucky. And then Duke, a team that everyone is hyped about because of their freshman phenom, Cooper Flagg. But it's not just Cooper Flagg, let me tell you. It's Con Kneppel. It's Kaman Malwalk. It's all of these young guys. And then it's the veterans in Tyrese Proctor and Caleb Foster who really add to this team. Really gives them the perimeter threat, really makes it easy for these freshmen to insert themselves into the team. So overall, these 4 teams, highly scary. Houston and Iowa State defensively, Kentucky and Duke for more layered attacks. But any one of these teams could potentially win the championship come March. But in terms of Tier 2 teams, this is where it gets kind of interesting and a little bit more messy. These are teams that I feel are at the very least Elite 8 contenders, could push into the Final Four, could even win the national championship, but they still are that tier below these 4 elite teams, in my opinion. They are the Kansas Wildcats, a very deep and experienced team, but it all comes down to health and perimeter shooting, and I feel like they have that, but they really need to put it all together in big games. They have the ability, they have the big man up front in Hunter Dickinson. They have fascinating players in the backcourt like DeJuan Harris, very underrated point guard. But I think most of it's going to come from the production up front. Not just Hunter Dickinson, but impressive, I believe, second-year man Floyd Badunga. I really like him as well. But ultimately, this Kansas team really could shock a lot of people. They were the preseason AP #1 team. They kind of had a couple of pratfalls along the way, but they are a team highly capable of amping it up come March Madness. Then UCLA, kind of a surprise team this year in the Big Ten. Top offense, but only when Dylan Andrews is in. He's dealing with injuries. He's their top point guard, one of their top players. They just had a bizarre loss to Rutgers. My dad was pretty happy about that, though, as a Rutgers alum. But ultimately, UCLA is one of those teams that just needs to catch fire. They don't have the Johnny Juzangs and Jaime Hawkins of the world anymore, and Mick Cronin has been growing a little bit frustrated with how this team has been playing over the past couple of weeks. So they're highly capable offensively, but they need Dylan Andrews to be that point general for them consistently. And then a team like UConn, a team I'm all too familiar with as a Xavier fan over there in the Big East. I think that this is an iteration of this team that has its flaws. Alex Caravan potentially not playing as well as people thought he was, being the leader of this team, and the front court potentially not playing up to par. I do think that Hassan Diarra is one of the more underrated big men in the country. He just needs to play like it. And then the addition of a top recruit in Liam McNeely, that transition potentially not as hopeful as it seemed. And then Aiden Mahaney, the St. Mary's transfer, presumably coming in to fix the perimeter shooting. He certainly can at certain points of the season, but ultimately not coalescing as people think. They need better defense for all of these fantastic Big East offenses and beyond. But I do think that this UConn team kind of goes under the radar a little bit. But ultimately, in terms of overall outlook, they certainly are a team that can spring a surprise. And then I would throw in, say, a team like Auburn. I think that they're a very talented team and very well could be the #1 team in the country. But that Johnny Broome injury, let's see how significant that is. And can these transfers in Chad Baker-Mazara and Denver Jones continue playing at a high level and consistently for this Auburn team? And then Tennessee have a couple of fantastic players. I think that I have always appreciated Tennessee as one of the more high-profile SEC teams, but this year just feels a little bit different than other years. They don't have someone like Connect to touch the floor. I do like Sakai Ziegler as more of a floor general, kind of a Tiger Campbell-like player, if you remember him from UCLA. But it's going to come down to, can they continue beating the elite teams they need to succeed come March Madness? Are they going to be battle tested enough? So those 2 teams I would put in Tier 2 as well, but ultimately these are the teams that are on the precipice of being potential Final Four contenders, in my opinion. But they're not quite there yet. But I do consider all of them highly, and they just need a couple things to go right for them. And then, last but not least, we have Tier 3 here. And Tier 3 is a group of teams who I haven't necessarily seen that much this year, but I know that a lot of people come March Madness time are going to love them in terms of their brackets. I know a lot of these people or pundits potentially see them as the dark horse candidates to make deep runs in the tournament. And I can ultimately see a way and path that they can. I really like this Oregon team, one of the deepest teams in the country, and Texas Tech. Speaking of teams who are going to be battle-tested in the Big 12, already very battle-tested. Tough loss at home against an Iowa State team that ultimately has been very tough to beat, but proven that they can go toe-to-toe with those kind of teams. The youngest Toppin brother leading them, JT. I love his explosiveness on both sides of the court, and I really think that ultimately this Texas Tech team can't be underestimated just because they play in a loaded conference and might fall by the wayside in terms of seeding and go under the radar in a lot of people's brackets come March. And last but not least, let's talk about the Purdue Boilermakers, a team that has lost its luster ever since Zach Edey left, but still have the players, some players from last year's Final Four run and ultimately championship game run, where they finished runners-up. But ultimately, I do think this Purdue team can concentrate on other aspects of what makes them stellar outside of just feeding Zach Edey like last year. They have Braden Smith and Fletcher Loyer, both players who can lead the team in terms of, for Smith, being their kind of point general, leading them on the offensive side of the floor. Fletcher Loyer, kind of the three-point specialist for them. Trey Kaufman-Renn, a kind of Swiss Army knife, can play multiple positions. Cameron Heide obviously going to have to step up in the front court as well as Caleb First, a player who's been around a lot in this roster but hasn't been getting that much playing time because of Zach Edey's presence for the past couple of years. He's going to have to step up, but ultimately I do like the leadership of this Purdue team. But ultimately these three teams in Tier 3 are teams that I think you have to watch out for in March Madness. Maybe they're not the teams that will ultimately contend for a national title, but I do think that they could break a couple brackets if things go their way. But ultimately, looking at this tier, I like all of these teams here. I've watched them in terms of varying degrees. I kind of know a little bit more about, say, Duke or Kentucky than I do about, say, Kansas or UCLA. But ultimately, I think that all of these teams, for the reasons I have explained and put forth, can ultimately challenge for the national championship. Let me know what you think if you're a college basketball fan and you know a little bit more about these teams, or might want to even throw one of your own teams into the ring as well as a potential contender. But coming up next, we preview another fascinating basketball game taking place out in the Western Conference between the Houston Rockets, the stunningly red-hot Rockets, and the Denver Nuggets, a bizarre team in the Western Conference, so to speak. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about it.